Reform UK's latest attack on the BBC is a curious exercise in selective memory. We're told that the BBC is targeting Reform councillors and that this is supposedly something that proves its structural bias. The party's analysis claims that 95% of stories involving Reform councillors who resigned or were expelled have been covered by the BBC, compared with just 15% for Labour and Conservative councillors. The implication is that the BBC is doing the establishment's dirty work. Well, the problem is it's the Reform councillors who are, for the most part, the ones at fault. The narrative collapses the moment we actually look at the landscape. Few political figures have benefited more from sustained BBC exposure than Nigel Farage. Question Time, Newsnight, the main bulletins. His media presence has been a defining feature of British politics for more than a decade. The BBC has platformed him repeatedly as a colourful, combative voice. His views have regularly shaped running orders, call-in shows, headline segments. To suggest that the BBC is systematically silencing or marginalising Reform is to ignore that history completely. What then is the new complaint really about? Reform's councillor cohort is tiny by comparison with Labour's or the Conservatives. With fewer elective representatives, every suspension or defection is far more conspicuous. When a major party loses a councillor, it's a drop in the ocean and barely background noise. When a new insurgent party loses one, it's a story about whether the enterprise is serious, stable and ready for governing responsibilities. Proportion matters. Moreover, Reform has positioned itself as a party of discipline and plain speaking. If your brand rests on promises of vetting, competence and restoring order, any example of misconduct sticks like glue. And it's not bias that drives interest, but the political narrative the party has chosen. Reform's response has been to present the BBC as part of a cosy cartel. This is a familiar populist strategy. You're either with the people or you're part of the establishment conspiracy, yet the charge is inconsistent. Richard Tice boasts that Reform is picking up the pieces, running councils more efficiently, saving residents money. On that basis, scrutiny should be welcomed. An ambitious party asking voters to trust it with national power cannot claim to be immune from public accountability. The BBC also has recent form on apologising to Farage, and that must be acknowledged. Its handling of the Coutts banking story was sloppy. A later on-air reference to his language was ill-judged. These errors have fuelled suspicion, but isolated missteps are not an argument for institutional persecution. Still less proof of a corporation pursuing vendettas against Reform. The backdrop to all this is significant. The BBC's Director General has resigned following a crisis in public trust. There is intense pressure to demonstrate even-handedness. Reform's allegation lands at a moment when the corporation is vulnerable and cautious. Any claim of bias becomes amplification in itself. Ultimately, impartiality is not measured by counting news articles. It's measured by whether journalists apply the same standard to each political actor based on relevance, impact and public interest. On that measure, the BBC's record with Reform UK is far from hostile. Farage has arguably been one of its greatest beneficiaries. This dispute should therefore be seen for what it is and fight for narrative control. Reform wants to frame criticism as elitist aggression. The BBC wants to show that it's still the national broadcaster that reports without fear or favour. In the end, audiences are savvy enough to recognise two simple truths. Reform is now a significant political force and must expect tough scrutiny, and the BBC has helped make it a significant political force. So if there is bias here, it's that the story being told about the bias, and it's about the bias in the other direction. The BBC is biased in favour of Reform, not against Reform.